I'm not sure whether or not I want to jump into school right now.
Just sort of weighing my options out.
Should I stand up for what I believe in?
I've been thinking about becoming a vegetarian.
I am very indecisive when I go to the grocery store.
Whether I'm going to leave work early or not.
I was going to pick either a wolf or a traditional dagger.
I have to choose my toothpaste. I have to choose what cereal.
I'm in between a rock and a hard place. Do I want to make money or do I want to love what I do?
I'm trying to decide if I can have another child.
It's sort of like every time I decide in my head on one of them, the other one speaks up.
We can imagine these alternate dimensions where we do make the different choices, and there's so many of them that it's hard to accept the one that we choose.
All right, so just to warn you on the front end, you will probably see me grabbing my water bottle and taking a sip after every single fill-in today. If I can make it through today without having a coughing attack, it will be a miracle. Who here is sick? Who here gets sick on the week of Christmas like every year? All right, me. Awesome. Well, I am sick, and I apologize if you see me having a coughing attack. We'll have like a symbol. If I need help, I'll just go like this, okay? Otherwise, just let me get over it. But today is the very last day of 2017. And I don't know what 2017 was like for you. For some of you, it might have been a great year. For some of you, it might have been a weird year. Some of you, it might have been a bad year. But tomorrow when we wake up, it is not only a new work week, it is not only a new month, it is a new year. And there's something about a new year, at least for me, that gives me hope. Hope because I can wake up tomorrow and I can say, I have not made any bad decisions this year yet. And for you, you could probably say the same thing, unless, of course, you made a bad decision after midnight or you slept in till 2 p.m. and you're just regretting that already. But for the most part, a new year means a fresh start. A new year means a clean slate. We can make some better decisions. And by the way, that is why we love New Year's resolutions, is because we can make some better decisions in 2018. We love New Year's resolutions because we have a clean slate. We can make new decisions, new goals in life. So starting today, we're doing a new message series called I Choose. And over the next few weeks, all the weeks of January, we're going to be talking about different decisions we can make in 2018 that will set us up for a better year, that will set us up for a successful and a spiritually successful year. So next week, we're going to talk about surrender or control. So all my fellow control freaks out there, which I'm one of them, by the way, it's going to get real next week. The week after that, we're going to talk about discipline and regrets. After that, we're going to talk about the difference between important and urgent, which sometimes we think are the same thing, but they're not, and we'll talk about the difference. But today, to kick off the series, we're going to talk about purpose over popularity. Purpose over popularity, because there's two things that I know about almost everyone in this room today. One is that we want our lives to mean something, right? We want purpose in our life. We want to make a difference in this world. We want to be a part of something. And if we are a Christian, we want to live for the purposes of God. I mean, of the thousands of conversations I've had with different Christians in my lifetime, the number one thing that they're concerned about is living in the will of God. We want to live in the will of God. I think when I was a teenager in youth group, that was my only prayer request ever, was for probably a girlfriend, and then also that I would live in the will of God, that I would live for the purposes of God. See, we want our lives to mean something. We want purpose. And the second thing I know about almost everyone in this room is we like it when people like us. We want to be liked. We want to be approved. We want to be accepted. I think the best word, I just use it, but I think the best word is approved. We want approval from others. Just a couple weeks ago, I shared with you how this has been a lifelong struggle for me, this need for approval, how sometimes I would go as far as compromising my values just to be accepted or to be liked or to be approved by others. And after each of the three services, person after person would come up to me and say how much they related to that part of the message, which was a small part of the message, but people connected with that. And it got me thinking that I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one that lives with the sense that we always need to be liked and approved. We want to impress people. We want to be liked. We want to be accepted. And by the way, I think the culture that we live in makes it easier and easier to fall into this trap. We live in a culture that has become obsessed with trying to impress others. Dave Ramsey, who's a financial guru, he kind of helps people get out of debt and teaches people how to handle finances from a biblical point of view. He says it this way, and I love this quote. He says, "We buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like, or maybe impress people we don't know. We buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like." I mean, you take away our need to impress other people, and I think a lot of our debt might go away. And that's funny, but I think that quote is true. I was just listening to this podcast a couple weeks ago about this whole idea of impressing others and kind of status symbols and stuff like that. And the host of the podcast was telling this story about a girl that she was good friends with back in high school. And this girl's mother drove a Jaguar, a really nice, really expensive car. And this girl the one day was complaining about how frugal her mother was. Her mother was always frugal with finances and was telling her how finances were tight at home. And the host of the podcast asked her back when they were in high school, like, that's weird. Your mom's driving a Jaguar, yet things are tight financially. She's driving a Jaguar, but she's always frugal. Like, how does that work? And her friend just responded, "Oh, that's just to impress her friends." And like she bought this car to kind of show off a status symbol that she didn't even have. She was living for the approval of others. Now that's an extreme example, and don't hear what I'm not saying, by the way. It's okay to have a nice thing. Like, go ahead, have a nice car. It's okay to have nice things. There's nothing wrong with that. But our motivation can be wrong. Isn't it true that we make some decisions for the sole purpose of approval? That we make some decisions for the sole purpose of being approved, being liked by other people. You know, there's a big difference between being at a store and trying on a shirt and thinking, "Ooh, this shirt's really nice. I really like this shirt." There's a big difference between that and thinking, if I get this, people will think I'm rich. If I get this, people will think I'm this or that. There's a big difference between the two. Sometimes we become obsessed with the things we have, the things we buy. Sometimes we buy things or wear things or drive things for the sole purpose of approval and impressing others. Sometimes we post pictures on social media for the sole purpose of impressing others, right? Get the lighting right. How do you make the fish face? Is it? Now, is it wrong to post a selfie? No. But the motivation can be, and before you think I'm coming too hard on those who are posting selfies, I'm going to get real vulnerable with you. Here's some pictures of me from 14 years ago. I was 16 years old. Everyone has a bathroom picture at some point, right? So it's not wrong to post a selfie. It's not wrong to have nice things. But what I want us to focus on is our motivation. Are we doing things for likes on Facebook or Instagram? Are we doing things to impress people at a red light, people that we may never meet? Why are we doing these things? And so for the truth for today, the bottom line of everything we're going to talk about is this, and you can fill this in if you're taking notes, is living for the approval of others keeps us from the purposes of God. Living for the approval of others keeps us from the purposes of God. Our memory verse for today, and this is my life verse. What we mean by life verse is just kind of a verse that is personal to us, that maybe has changed our life, and this is that for me, is Galatians 1:10. It says, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." See, because Paul says still trying to please people, I think what he is saying and what this could actually be translated is that my motivation for everything I once did was to gain the approval of others and to please people. My motivation now is to serve God. I am now living for the purposes of God. So if we can, what I'd like to do now is I want to switch gears and I want to talk more about purpose. Now, again, like we talked about earlier, we all want to live for something, right? We all want this purpose in our life, whether we're a Christian or not. The average person wants to make a difference in the world. We want to live for something greater than ourselves. But what I want to focus on specifically today is our day-to-day purpose. Like there's a difference, and honestly, sometimes we get wrapped up in our overall purpose in life. Again, we all want to know why we are here on earth, and we get wrapped up in our overall purpose, whether it's a career or that one defining moment in our life, and that's great, but I want to talk about our day-to-day purpose, and we'll call this lowercase p purpose. Lowercase purpose compared to uppercase purpose. If our uppercase purpose is changing the world, lowercase purpose might be in the moment we see a need, our purpose is to meet that need. In a moment, if we see someone who needs encouragement, our purpose in that moment is to encourage that person or to give to a cause or to pray for a specific purpose, our lowercase purpose. And the reason I want to focus on these smaller things is because over time, as we're faithful with these small purposes of God, He will begin to trust us with some bigger purposes. Jesus tells us in the Gospels that those who can be trusted with the little things will eventually be trusted with the larger things in life. So if we focus on the day-to-day purposes in our life, eventually we will find our uppercase purpose. So if you want your life to be filled with purpose and fulfilling God's purpose for you in the world, what I did, I made a list of 3 things. Actually, on Monday, I made a list of probably 20 different things. And I was just kind of asking God, what are our purposes in this life? Just generally that apply to everyone. What is our purpose in life? And I narrowed it down to 3 different things that I think cover a lot of them. And we could talk about a lot more, but I just want to focus on these 3 things. 3 decisions that if we make in 2018 will change our life. 3 decisions that if we make in 2018 will change the trajectory of where we're going spiritually. 3 decisions, and by the way, these are all really, really practical things. I chose ones that we could literally start this afternoon if we wanted to. So here's the 3 things. The first one is this, is that I will choose to know God. I will choose to know God. I want you to think for a moment about the person who is closest to you in life. For some of you, it might be a son or a daughter. It might be a mother or a father. It could be a sibling. It could be a coworker, or a business partner, whatever. For a lot of you, it's going to be like it is for me. My spouse is the closest person to me. And to use myself as an example, my wife and I, Danielle, we've known each other for just over 9 years. We've been married for about 7.5 years. And she is the person that I know best. And she is the person that best knows me. But how did that happen? Time. It was those hours and hours and hours on the phone while we were dating. Just like it seemed like we were talking about nothing, but it was those hours and hours on the phone. It was those hours that we spent when we were engaged. We just lay under the stars talking about our future. It was the times when we'd travel together or go on dates. It was the hundreds and hundreds of walks we would go on, the hundreds and hundreds of times we go for ice cream during the summer. It was time spent with each other. That is how we know each other so well. That is how I can pick up on these subtle little things where she doesn't even have to say anything and I can know what she's thinking. Now imagine just for a minute that if over these last 9 years, imagine if we had only talked for 1 hour a week. 1 hour a week, and during that hour I was a little distracted. I had other things going on. Maybe every 3 weeks I had to miss that hour because it was nice out and I had other things going on. Occasionally during those 1 hour per week, I would send a text message, especially if I needed something. I would send a text message or make a quick phone call, but I was never consistent with that. Imagine how close we would be. We wouldn't be nearly as close. Our knowledge of each other would be relatively surface level. We wouldn't be able to finish each other's sentences. We wouldn't be able to know what each other was thinking just by our body language. We wouldn't be nearly as close. See, why is it that we, and I'm using we on purpose because I need to hear this as much as I think some of us need to hear it. Why is it that we sometimes expect our relationship to God to be really deep, really close, yet we spend very, very little time with Him? You know what's cool about my relationship with God? It's those nonverbal senses of communication. It's the times when I can tell she's excited. It's the times when I can tell she's mad. It's the times when I can tell that she needs to hear me say, I'm sorry, and I'm working on that one. By the way, that's a 2018 New Year's resolution. Say I'm sorry quicker. But I can pick up on those things because I know her so well. And you know what happens when we have a close relationship with God? We pick up on those subtle things as well. We'll feel God nudging us in a certain direction. We'll feel God, this sense that we just need to encourage this person or pray for this person. We'll feel God nudging us towards or maybe away from a situation or a circumstance, towards or away from a relationship. But we only get that when we know God on a deep level. If we don't spend enough time with him, our knowledge of him and how we know him and the things we pick up on will be surface level. So challenge number 1 for 2018 is to choose to know God deeper this year. Make a decision to know God deeper. Carve out time each and every day that you can get alone with God and just know him better. And by the way, there's no right way to do this. If you look at kind of the disciplines in my own life, I switch it up all the time. I'm not really good with a routine in this area. There's some days that I'll read a verse and I'll just meditate on that verse for a while. Other days I'll read chapters. Some days I'll read a book that helps me grow spiritually. I'll go for a walk and just bring in the goodness of God. And I switch it up all the time. And if maybe you have a good routine, but you feel like you've just plateaued spiritually, I would encourage you to switch it up. I mean, imagine if every single week, Danielle and I, we went on the exact same date, talked about the exact same things, ate the exact same food. At some point, that gets boring, right? So switch it up. Invest some time in getting to know God better. Treat it like a real relationship. So the first thing is to know God. The second choice is this: I will choose to live in obedience. I will choose to live in obedience. So before we jump too much into this one, I do want to make one thing clear, that we do not and cannot earn God's love or forgiveness or salvation through obedience. None of that is based on anything we do or don't do. The only way we receive salvation and forgiveness is by God's grace, meaning we don't earn it. It's something that's offered freely to us and through faith in Jesus. So it's by grace and through faith. But that being said, I want to take a look at what James, who is the brother of Jesus, says about faith. And he makes this connection to faith in obedience. And by the way, anytime I read from the book of James, I love making this, reflecting on this point that James was the brother of Jesus and he believed that he was the Son of God. Anyone have a brother here? I mean, what would it take for you to believe that he was the Son of God? Like, more than him just saying that he's the Son of God, right? And James, probably rightfully so, didn't believe he was the Son of God until after the resurrection. But anyways, this is what James had to say about obedience and faith. And James 1:22, he says, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says." He says in chapter 2, verse 17, he says, "Faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead." I love how the Message translation words this verse. It says, "Isn't it obvious that God talk without God acts is outrageous nonsense?" See, we can't separate obedience from purpose, and we can't separate knowing God from obedience either. I mean, imagine if we got number 1 on the message notes correct. We knew God better this year. We woke up an hour early and spent time with him, prayed, read our entire Bible over the year, but we didn't do anything it said. What would be the point of that? Now, God doesn't expect us to be perfect by any means, but if our faith is genuine, it will be backed by action and obedience. Real faith has action behind it. I became a Christian when I was really young, but for a couple of years, I went through the stage of rebellion, and I distanced myself from God. And I shared most of this story with you before, but my life consumed mostly of partying and drinking, and this was like right at the end of high school and into the first year of college. Well, to make a long story short, when I was 19 years old, that is when I decided to turn things around in my life. I recommitted my life to Jesus, and I began to take my faith seriously again. And one of the first decisions I made was I was going to stop drinking alcohol until I turned 21. Do I think drinking alcohol is a sin? No, I don't. But if we're getting drunk, if we're causing others to stumble, if we become dependent on it or do it illegally, which I was, then it is. So as a 19-year-old, I made the decision that until I was 21, I just wasn't going to touch it. And this wasn't exactly an easy decision or an easy thing to do, because every friend I had was drinking. Every friend I had, my roommates at the time, I didn't live at home, my roommates were all partying almost every single night. I mean, that was all I and all my friends knew, but I was all in. And I knew that if I was truly going to turn my life around, that it would have to start with some small acts of obedience. So I stopped drinking. And I didn't until I was 21. What this meant for me, I had to move out of that apartment because I knew I would fall into temptation way too easily. My very best friend at the time, and still to this day, might be one of the best friends I've ever had in my life. I had to put a little bit of distance between us because I knew he had influence in my life. And during this time, I learned this little phrase that I live by, one of the phrases of my life, that I will trust God with the consequences of my obedience. I will trust God. I'll do my part and be obedient, and I'll trust God with the details, whatever that means. And in this case, if the consequence of me obeying God by not drinking and stepping back from some unhealthy friendships, if that meant that I lost all of my close friends, that was okay. I would trust God with the results of my obedience. If I still keep that phrase close to my heart, and it's something that I live by, when things are tight financially, if the consequence of me giving to God means that I can't save like I'd like to, or I can't go out to eat as much as I'd like to, if that's a consequence of me being obedient and giving to God, that's okay. I will be obedient and I'll trust God with the details. If taking a major pay cut was a consequence of my obedience to the calling that God placed in my life to pursue full-time ministry as a career, that's okay. I'll be obedient to the calling of my life and I'll trust God with the rest. If giving up a week of vacation and resources is the consequence of my obedience to go on a short-term missions trip and serve God, then I will trust God with the consequences of my obedience. If giving up an hour every single week of relaxing time or maybe Netflix time is the consequence of serving God in the local church, then I will trust God with the consequences of my obedience. See, we can do our part. We can be obedient and just leave the details up to God. See, never in my life have I met someone who regretted an act of obedience to God. Never in my life have I regretted doing something in obedience to God. On the contrary, anytime I've stepped out in obedience, the amount of blessing and the amount of growth in my life has been life-changing. And by the way, the larger the sacrifice or the larger the step of obedience, the greater the blessing. And when we do this in the day-to-day things, the small steps of obedience, the small acts of obedience, we begin to find purpose in our life. So we'll choose to know God, we'll choose to be obedient, and the last choice we make in order to choose purpose is I will choose to love. I'll choose to love. Look at how these words from John, and John was Jesus' probably closest friend in the Bible, one of the disciples. Look at how he connects obedience to love in 2 John 1:6. He says, "And this is love, that we walk in obedience to his commands. As you have heard from the beginning, his command is that you walk in love." So to love is to be obedient, and to be obedient is to love. And by the way, this is where religion gets it wrong sometimes. Because let's be honest, when we think of the word obedience or we think of the word religion even, what do we tend to think of? We tend to think of rules. We tend to think of what we can do, what we can't do. We want to put everything in these neat little boxes of yes and no, right and wrong. And rules complicate things. Rules make it easy to compare ourselves to others. Religion loves rules. But this is what I want us to understand today, is that knowing God and obeying God directs us to love. It directs us to love. In fact, the reason God wants us to know him and to obey him is not for him. God doesn't need our obedience. It's for us. Let me demonstrate with this verse. In Jesus' day, the Pharisees, they were obsessed with the law. They lived they knew the Old Testament like the back of their hand. They knew all the laws, and they lived by them really, really well. They thought the law was everything. And because of that, they also thought they were superior to everyone because they knew it better than anyone and they followed it better than anyone. But in all the scriptures and the Gospels, Jesus came down really hard on the Pharisees. And I think the reason why is because they didn't get the purpose of the law. They didn't get the purpose of the rules. And one of the conversations that Jesus had with the Pharisees concerned the Sabbath, which was a rule that God put in place that one day a week his people would rest. Now, the Pharisees, they took this to the extreme. They viewed anything and everything as work. And at this one point, they accused Jesus' disciples of working on the Sabbath because as they were walking through a field, they were picking heads of grain to eat. That would be like me putting something in the microwave on the Sabbath day and cooking it for a meal. I mean, it was just ridiculous. They took it to the extreme, and Jesus responds, and I love this verse. It says in Mark 2:27, this is Jesus talking. He says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." See, God did not create us to follow the rules. He created the rules because he loves us. God knew that a life, in this instance, that a life without rest is not sustainable. He knew that for us to live to our fullest potential, that to work rest into our weekly rhythm would be good for us. So he gave us the Sabbath because he loves us. It's for us. Should we obey the Sabbath? Yeah. Is it a sin to ignore it? Yeah. But he did it for us. It exists for us. And every time we act in obedience, every time we take a step in obedience, it is a way for us to show God our love for him. And the things that he asks us to do is a way for him to show love to us. In fact, you can summarize the entire Bible with the word love. Jesus was asked by probably one of the Pharisees the question, what is the greatest commandment? Of everything in the scriptures, of everything that is written, of everything you've been teaching Jesus, what is the most important thing? And Jesus replied in Matthew chapter 22, it says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these commandments. Everything hangs on these two commandments. In fact, and I've said this before, but if we get these two right, everything else works themselves out. If we love God perfectly, if we love others perfectly, sin just isn't an issue in our lives. It would be impossible to sin. See, when everything we do is centered on love, you know what we find in life? Purpose. You know what we don't care about? Acceptance. What others think of us. If they like us. We don't think about popularity. Those things are inward focused, but love is always focused outwardly. So this year, choose to know God. Choose to obey God, but most importantly, choose to love. Choose to love your spouse the way that Jesus loves the church, and you'll find purpose in your marriage. Choose to love your neighbor as yourself, and you'll find purpose in your neighborhood. Choose to love your boss at work by working to the best of your ability, even if they don't like you, they don't treat you well. Choose to love them, and you will find purpose in your career. Choose to love God by being obedient. You will find purpose in life, and you will reap the benefits. See, when we choose to know God, to obey, and to love, we're choosing purpose. So one of the things that I love to do every December, usually my wife and I, we take a few days off. The 27th is her birthday, and so we'll take a couple days off and just enjoy the holidays together. And I usually carve out a couple hours and of just reflection time that I can reflect back on the past year, what God's done in my life. I'll set some goals for the new year, just some personal goals. And this year, one of the things I did, I started reading through some old journal entries. I started with just this past year, and I don't journal a whole lot, but sometimes I just like to write down what God's doing in my life. And I started to go through some of my older journals, and I came across this entry that as of tomorrow, this will be exactly 10 years old. So this was like shortly after the selfie, but not too much after that. But this journal entry was from January 1st, 2008. And just so you kind of understand the timeline, this was about 2.5 to 3 months after I recommitted my life to Jesus. This is about 2.5, 3 months after I decided that I was going to take that step of obedience and not drink until I was 21. And this is what I wrote January 1st, 2008. It says, as the first day of the year comes to an end, I feel very excited. 2007 was a roller coaster for me. I seemed to be living with one foot in the Lord and one foot in the world. It wasn't until about mid-October that I finally allowed God back inside my life, and I stopped shutting him out. My only regret is not doing it sooner. These past few months have been remarkable. God has spoken to me like never before and has taken me to another level spiritually. He has opened so many doors in my life and has blessed me so much. He has also answered countless prayers. All this in a mere 3 months. I can only imagine where my life would be if I'd given him the whole year. This year will be different. God has already worked to put me in the right circumstances to start the year out right. New friends, living back at home, a better job situation are some of the ways God has recently blessed me. It amazes me how much I've grown, changed, and matured over the past year, and I can't wait to see where God will take me this year. 2008 was better. It was the year I met my wife. It was the year that I decided I was going to go all in for ministry and change my major at college. 10 years ago was a fresh start for me. Tomorrow can be a fresh start for you. One of my favorite quotes of all time is that the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. The second best time is today. So what decisions will you make for 2018? Are you content with where your spiritual life is? Are you content with the way you've been loving your spouse, loving your neighbors? Are you content with what you're doing at work and how you're loving the people you work with? Have you been choosing to obey, or are there some new steps that you can take this year? Small steps of obedience. Small ways that you can trust God with the consequences of your obedience. Is there ways that things you can do, changes you can make to know God better this year?